Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to a series of videos in which I'm reading you a book. We are reading Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. We are in part 2 of Pride and Prejudice. And we have reached a very sad, very low point. It looks like Charlotte Lucas, Elizabeth Bennet's best friend, is going to marry the horrible Mr. Collins. It looks like Mr. Bingley, who fell in love with Jane Bennet, and she with him during his brief stay in the country, has left the country and will be gone for quite some time, probably long enough to have his affections suborned elsewhere. It looks like all of these things are going to happen, and that there was a brief flutter of activity where it looked like the lives of some of the Bennet girls might change, and now that flutter of activity is over. So we are in chapter 25, which is chapter 2 of part 2 of Jane. I'm not going to continue with this. I'm just going to continue with the number of chapters as if this were all just one book. It is all just one book. So the immediate context of this chapter is that Mr. Collins has returned to Longbourn. He stayed for a bit. He proposed to Elizabeth. He was shot down. He was consoled by Charlotte Lucas and then slowly realized, well, I could propose to her. I need to come out of Hertfordshire with a wife. I could do that. And so he did, and she accepted him, much to the horror of her friend. And then he left, and most of the people at Longbourn were only too happy to see him go. He stuck around for too long and isn't very nice company. But he wrote a letter in just recently and said, I will be back, of course. He wants to come back into the neighborhood because he wants to continue pitching woo to Charlotte Lucas. And rather than stay at Lucas Lodge, her own home, he stays at Longbourn, which is effectively his own home, since it will come to him in the terms of the entail. So now we are up to chapter 25. After a week spent in professions of love and schemes of felicity, Mr. Collins was called from his amiable Charlotte by the arrival of Saturday. The pain of separation, however, might be alleviated on his side by preparations for the reception of his bride, as he had reason to hope that shortly after his next return into Hertfordshire the day would be fixed that was to make him the happiest of men. He took leave of his relation at Longbourn with as much solemnity as before, wished his fair cousin's health and happiness again, and promised their father another letter of thanks. On the following Monday, Mrs. Bennet had the pleasure of receiving her brother and his wife, who came as usual to spend the Christmas at Longbourn. Mr. Gardiner was a sensible, gentlemanlike man, greatly superior to his sister as well by nature as education. The Netherfield ladies would have had difficulty in believing that a man who lived by trade and within view of his own warehouses, a very Jane Austen notice, very Jane Austen detail. He doesn't just live by trade. He's not just a merchant. He lives within view of his own warehouses. Because that's just the kind of place that Gracechurch Street is. The Netherfield ladies would have had difficulty in believing that a man who lived by trade and within view of his own warehouses could have been so well bred and agreeable. Mrs. Gardiner, who was several years younger than Mrs. Bennet and Mrs. Phillips, was an amiable, intelligent, elegant woman, and a great favorite with all her Longbourn nieces. Between the two eldest and herself especially, there subsisted a very particular regard. They had frequently been staying with her in town. So that's a little detail that we didn't quite know before. Elizabeth and Jane, at least, don't spend all their time going back and forth between Longbourn Estate and Meryton, talking about bonnets. They often visit their aunt, Gardiner, in town. The first part of Mrs. Gardiner's business on her arrival was to distribute her presents and describe the newest fashions. When this was done, she had a less active part to play. It became her turn to listen. Mrs. Bennet had many grievances to relate and much to complain of. They had all been very ill-used since she last saw her sister. 2 of her girls had been on the point of marriage, and after all there was nothing in it. I do not blame Jane, she continued, for Jane would have got Mr. Bingley if she could, but Lizzie, oh, sister, it is very hard to think that she might have been Mr. Collins' wife by this time, had it not been for her own perverseness. He made her an offer in this very room, and she refused him. The consequence of it is that Lady Lucas will have a daughter married before I have, and that Longbourn Estate is just as much entailed as ever. The Lucases are very artful people indeed, sister. They are all for what they can get. I'm sorry to say it of them, but so it is. It makes me very nervous and poorly to be thwarted so in my own family, and to have neighbors who think of themselves before anybody else. However, your coming just at this time is the greatest of comforts, and I'm very glad to hear what you have to tell us of long sleeves. Fashion. Mrs. Gardiner, to whom the chief of this news had been given before, in the course of Jane and Elizabeth's correspondence with her, made her sister a slight answer, and in compassion to her nieces, turned the conversation. When alone with Elizabeth afterwards, she spoke more on the subject. "It seems likely to have been a desirable match for Jane," said she. "I'm sorry it went off. But these things happen so often. A young man, such as you describe, Miss Bingley, so easily falls in love with a pretty girl for a few weeks, and when accident separates them, so easily forgets her, that these sorts of inconstancies are very frequent." "An excellent consolation in its way," said Elizabeth, "but it will not do for us. We do not suffer by accident. It does not often happen that the interference of friends will persuade a young man of independent fortune to think no more of a girl whom he is violently in love with only a few days before." But that expression of violently in love is so hackneyed, so doubtful, so indefinite, that it gives me very little idea. It is as often applied to feelings which arise from half an hour's acquaintance as to real strong attachment. Pray, how violent was Mr. Bingley's love? I never saw a more promising inclination. He was growing quite inattentive to other people, and wholly engrossed by her. Every time they met, it was more decided and remarkable. At his own ball, he offended 2 or 3 young ladies by not asking them to dance, and I spoke to him twice myself without receiving an answer. Could there be finer symptoms? Is not general incivility the very essence of love? God, I love this author. Is not general incivility the very essence of love? Oh, yes, of that kind of love which I suppose him to have felt. Poor Jane. I'm sorry for her, because with her disposition she may not yet get over it immediately. It had been better have happened to you, Lizzie. You would have laughed yourself out of it sooner. But do you think she would be prevailed upon to go back with us? Change of scene might be of service, and perhaps a little relief from home may be as useful as anything. In other words, when we're done visiting you for Christmas, why don't you come back to London with us? Elizabeth was exceedingly pleased with this proposal, and felt persuaded of her sister's ready acquiescence. I hope, added Mrs. Gardiner, that no consideration with regard to this young man will influence her. We live in so different a part of town, all our connections are so different, and as you well know, we go out so little that it is very improbable that they should meet at all, unless he really comes to see her. And that is quite impossible, this is Elizabeth responding, and that is quite impossible, for he is now in the custody of his friend, and Mr. Darcy would no more suffer him to call on Jane in such a part of London. My dear aunt, how could you think of it? Mr. Darcy perhaps may have heard of a place as Gracechurch Street, but he would hardly think it a month's ablution enough to cleanse him from its impurities, were he ever to enter it, and depend on it, Mr. Bingley never stirs without him. So once again, Darcy is suddenly in the conversation, just like last time. He's not part of this. But Elizabeth is assuring her aunt, oh, you don't have to worry about different locations or knowing different people. Darcy's such a snob that he would never go to Gracechurch Street. He would never go anywhere near the docks or the warehouses. So much the better. I hope they will not meet at all. But does not Jane correspond with the sister? She will not be able to help calling. She will drop the acquaintance entirely. See, so Elizabeth thinks nothing of the Bingley girls. She doesn't believe in anything good about them. But in spite of the certainty in which Elizabeth affected to place this point, as well as the still more interesting one of Bingley's being withheld from seeing Jane, she felt a solicitude on the subject which convinced her, on examination, that she did not consider it entirely hopeless. It was possible, sometimes she thought it probable, that his affection might be reanimated, and the influence of his friends successfully combated by the more natural influence of Jane's attachments. So she's not sure that if Jane goes to London, she won't bump into Mr. Bingley. She's not sure of that, especially if Bingley starts to learn that she is in town. Miss Bennet accepted her aunt's invitation with pleasure, and the Bingleys were no otherwise in her thoughts at the time than as she hoped that, by Caroline's not living in the same house with her brother, she might occasionally spend a morning with her without any danger of seeing him. The Gardiners stayed a week at Longbourn, and what with the Phillipses, the Lucases, and the officers, there was not a day without its engagements. Mrs. Bennet had so carefully provided for the entertainment of her brother and sister that they did not once sit down to a family dinner. When the engagement was for home, some of the officers always made a part of it. of which officers Mr. Wickham was sure to be one, and on these occasions Mrs. Gardiner, rendered suspicious by Elizabeth's warm commendation of him, narrowly observed them both. So the fact that Elizabeth is praising this guy makes Mrs. Gardiner suspicious. Without supposing them, from what she saw, to be very seriously in love, their preference for each other was plain. It was plain enough to make her a little uneasy, and she resolved to speak to Elizabeth on the subject before she left Hertfordshire, and represent to her the imprudence of encouraging such an attachment. Why? What's she got against Mr. Wickham? What is this coming from? Everyone who sees Wickham loves him, except Darcy. To Mrs. Gardiner, Wickham had one means of affording pleasure, unconnected with his general powers, and by general powers we mean his pillowy pecs and his gorgeous hips. About 10 or a dozen years ago, before her marriage, she had spent a considerable time in that very part of Derbyshire to which he belonged. They had, therefore, many acquaintances in common, and though Wickham had been little there since the death of Darcy's father, 5 years before, it was yet in his power to give her fresher intelligence of her former friends than she had been in way of procuring. Mrs. Gardiner had seen Pemberley, and known the late Mr. Darcy by character perfectly well. Here, consequently, was an inexhaustible subject of discourse. In comparing her recollection of Pemberley with the minute description which Wickham could give, and in bestowing her tribute of praise on the character of its late possessor, she was delighting both him and herself. On being made acquainted with the present Darcy's treatment of him, she tried to remember something of that gentleman's reputed disposition, when quite a lad, which might agree with it, and was confident at last that she recollected having heard Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy formerly spoken of as a very proud, ill-natured boy. So once again, the chapter ends all about Darcy, this guy who's not been in the narrative for chapters and chapters, who's not part of anything that's involved. Charlotte Lucas has contracted to marry Mr. Collins. Mr. Bingley seems indifferent to the fact that he is no longer in the company of Jane Bennet. Those things don't have anything to do with Mr. Darcy, but once again, he's in the narrative. Once again, he's our final word. Which is interesting, but I don't think it's the most interesting thing in this chapter. Do you? What is going on here? I know I've made this point before many, many times, but what does that paragraph mean about Mrs. Gardiner? What is this Jane Austen being coy? Or not? Is this just a wild coincidence? Is it possible that Elizabeth Bennet is not the first person in our cast of characters to fall in love with a Master of Pemberley? What is going on here? What don't we know? What aren't we being told about Mrs. Gardiner? Back when Darcy was a boy, when she wouldn't have had any contact with him, but she's been to Pemberley. Anyway, that is this chapter, and now we have the possibility of intrigue in the offing, because it's possible that Jane or Elizabeth or both will go to town, which is where all the rest of our characters are. So we'll wrap this up for now, and we'll be back next time. Thank you, BookTube.